The Winchester rifle cracked through the pre-dawn darkness, its echo bouncing off the wooden storefronts lining Deadwood's main street like a death knell. Deputy Marshal Marcus Webb jerked awake in his hotel bed, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt .45 on his nightstand. The second shot came before he could fully comprehend what was happening, followed by a woman's terrified scream that cut through the mountain air like a blade. Marcus swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor as another scream pierced the night. Through his second-story window, he could see shadows moving frantically in the street below, their forms illuminated by the flickering light of oil lamps being hastily lit in windows throughout the settlement. The third shot rang out, closer this time, and Marcus heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots running across wooden planks. He dressed quickly, pulling on his wool pants and leather boots with the practiced efficiency of a man who had awakened to violence more times than he cared to remember. The badge in his vest pocket felt heavier than usual as he pinned it to his chest, the federal marshal's star catching the weak lamplight filtering through his window. 6 months had passed since he'd accepted the assignment to Deadwood, 6 months since Sheriff Tobias Callahan had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and whispers of something unnatural stalking the Dakota Territory's most notorious mining town. Marcus grabbed his gun belt and hat, then bounded down the hotel's narrow staircase 2 steps at a time. The lobby was empty except for the desk clerk, a nervous man named Peterson who was peering through the front window with wide, frightened eyes. "What's happening out there?" Marcus demanded, buckling his gun belt as he approached the window. Peterson's hands trembled as he pointed down the street toward the old mining office. "It's Widow Henderson, Marshal." She came running out of her boarding house screaming about seeing something impossible. Said it was bigger than any man has a right to be, standing right there in her garden like it owned the place. Marcus pushed past the clerk and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, his boots echoing in the pre-dawn silence that had settled over the town following the gunshots. The air was crisp with the bite of early October, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the metallic tang that always seemed to hang over mining settlements. 3 men stood clustered around a small woman wrapped in a heavy shawl, their voices low and urgent as they tried to calm her obvious distress. As Marcus approached, he recognized the woman as Martha Henderson, a stern widow who ran the most respectable boarding house in Deadwood. She was not a woman given to flights of fancy or nervous disposition, which made her current state of agitation all the more concerning. Her face was pale in the lamplight, and her hands shook as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Mrs. Henderson," Marcus said, his voice gentle but authoritative. "I'm Deputy Marshal Webb. Can you tell me what happened?" The widow looked up at him with eyes that held a haunted quality Marcus had seen before in people who had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of the world. "Marshal Webb," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know how this is going to sound, but I saw him. I saw Sheriff Callahan standing in my vegetable garden not 10 minutes ago." One of the men, a burly miner named Collins, let out a derisive snort. "Now Martha, you know that's impossible. Big Tom's been missing for nigh on 8 months now. More likely you saw one of the Peterson boys sneaking around looking for trouble." Mrs. Henderson's eyes flashed with indignation. "I know what I saw, William Collins, and it wasn't any Peterson boy. This man was massive, taller than any human being has a right to be. He must have stood 8 feet if he stood an inch, and when he turned to look at me, his eyes glowed like hot coals in the darkness." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. In his 6 months in Deadwood, he had heard dozens of stories about the disappeared sheriff, most of them growing more elaborate with each telling. But there was something in Martha Henderson's voice, a bone-deep certainty that made him take her account more seriously than the usual tavern gossip. "Did this figure say anything to you?" Marcus asked, pulling out a small notebook from his vest pocket. "He didn't need to speak," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice growing stronger as she recounted the details. "The look in those eyes said everything. It was like he was searching for something or someone. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at my house, and then he turned and walked toward the old mining office. That's when I grabbed Samuel's old hunting rifle and fired those warning shots." Marcus glanced toward the mining office, a 2-story wooden structure that had been abandoned since the main veins played out 3 years earlier. The building stood at the far end of Main Street, its broken windows like dead eyes staring back at the town. Local children had long since learned to avoid the place, claiming it was haunted by the ghosts of miners who had died in cave-ins and accidents over the years. "Show me exactly where you saw this figure," Marcus said, leading Mrs. Henderson back toward her boarding house. The widow's garden was located behind her two-story home, a small plot of land where she grew vegetables to supplement the meals she served her boarders. As they rounded the corner of the house, Marcus immediately noticed the disturbance in the soft earth. Footprints pressed deep into the soil, each one easily twice the size of Marcus's own boot and sunk so deeply into the ground that they suggested tremendous weight. Marcus knelt down beside one of the prints, running his fingers along its edges. The impression was clear and well-defined, showing the outline of a large boot with a distinct heel pattern. More disturbing was the depth of the impression, which suggested that whatever had made it weighed considerably more than any normal human being. "These prints lead toward the mining office," Marcus observed, following the trail with his eyes as it wound between the houses and toward the abandoned building. Mrs. Henderson nodded emphatically. That's exactly the direction he went. Moved like he knew exactly where he was heading, too. Wasn't stumbling around like a drunk or someone lost in the dark. Marcus stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands as he considered the implications of what he was seeing. In his years as a lawman, he had learned to distinguish between the stories people told themselves and the evidence that didn't lie. The footprints were real, the widow's account was consistent, and the shots had been heard by multiple witnesses throughout the town. "I'm going to have a look at that mining office," Marcus announced. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to stay inside until daylight. If you see anything else unusual, don't try to handle it yourself. Come find me immediately." The walk to the mining office took Marcus through the heart of Deadwood's business district, past the saloons and gambling halls that were just beginning to quiet down as the night shift miners headed home and the day shift prepared for another descent into the mountains. The town had grown rapidly around the promise of gold, but that same promise had attracted every type of desperate character the frontier could produce. Sheriff Tobias Callahan had been the iron fist that kept the chaos from consuming the settlement entirely. Standing 6 feet 8 inches in his stocking feet and weighing close to 300 pounds, Big Tom had commanded respect through sheer physical presence as much as through his reputation for fair but uncompromising justice. His disappearance had left a void that Marcus was still struggling to fill, despite his federal authority and years of experience in similar settlements. The mining office loomed larger as Marcus approached, its weathered wooden siding gray in the pre-dawn light. The front door hung slightly ajar, something that struck Marcus as odd since the building had been securely boarded up when he had last checked it 3 weeks earlier. He drew his Colt and approached the entrance carefully, using his shoulder to push the door open wide enough to peer inside. The interior of the building was pitch black, filled with the musty smell of abandonment and something else that Marcus couldn't immediately identify. He struck a match, the small flame casting dancing shadows on the walls as he stepped across the threshold. The main room had been stripped of most of its furnishings years earlier, leaving only empty desks and filing cabinets scattered around the space. As Marcus moved deeper into the building, his match burned down to his fingers, forcing him to light another. In the fresh illumination, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh mud on the floor, tracked in by boots that matched the massive prints he had seen in Mrs. Henderson's garden. The trail led across the main room and toward a staircase that ascended to the building's second floor. Marcus followed the muddy footprints up the creaking stairs, each step echoing in the empty building like a gunshot. The second floor had once housed the mining company's administrative offices, but now contained only empty rooms and broken furniture. The trail led to the largest room at the back of the building, where a single window looked out over the hills that contained Deadwood's played-out gold mines. As Marcus stepped into the room, his match illuminated something that made him stumble backward in shock. Carved deep into the wooden wall were words that had not been there during his previous inspection of the building. The letters were massive, each one nearly a foot tall and gouged into the wood with such force that splinters and wood chips lay scattered on the floor beneath them. "They killed me for what I knew," the message read. "The truth lies beneath the mountain. Find the Apache bones." Marcus lit another match with hands that trembled slightly, studying the carved message more carefully. The wood around each letter was fresh, with sap still bleeding from the deeper cuts. Whatever had created this message had done so recently, possibly within the last few hours. The size and depth of the carving suggested immense strength, as if the letters had been gouged out with fingers rather than any conventional tool. As his match burned lower, Marcus noticed something else that sent a chill through his entire body. In the dust on the floor directly beneath the carved message, another set of the massive footprints was clearly visible. But these prints were different from the ones he had seen outside. These seemed to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light that became more visible as his match flame dimmed. The match burned out completely, plunging the room into darkness. In that moment of absolute blackness, Marcus heard something that made his heart race with primitive fear. Breathing. Slow, deep, and impossibly loud, as if coming from lungs the size of bellows. The sound seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, filling the room with a presence that felt both ancient and malevolent. Marcus fumbled for another match, his hands shaking as he tried to strike it against the rough wood of the matchbox. The breathing continued, growing louder and more pronounced, accompanied now by the sound of something large moving in the darkness around him. When the match finally flared to life, the room appeared empty, but the phosphorescent glow of the footprints had grown brighter, and new prints now surrounded the spot where Marcus stood. The deputy marshal backed toward the doorway, keeping the match held high as he tried to make sense of what he was experiencing. Every instinct told him to run, to flee the building and never return, but his duty as a lawman and his need to understand what had happened to Sheriff Callahan kept him rooted in place. As he reached the doorway, Marcus heard a sound that would haunt his dreams for years to come. A voice, deep and resonant, speaking from the darkness behind him with the unmistakable accent and cadence of Tobias Callahan. "The Apache curse is real, boy," the voice said, each word seeming to shake the very foundations of the building. "They buried their dead in sacred places, and we built our minds right through their bones. The mountain doesn't forget. The mountain doesn't forgive. And neither do I." Marcus spun around, holding his match high, but the room behind him was empty. Only the carved message remained, its letters seeming to pulse with their own inner light in the flickering flame. He backed out of the room and down the stairs, not turning his back on the building until he was standing in the street outside. Dawn was beginning to break over the hills surrounding Deadwood, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost obscene after the darkness Marcus had just experienced. As he stood there trying to make sense of what had happened, he noticed that other people were beginning to emerge from their homes and businesses, drawn by curiosity about the earlier gunshots and commotion. Among them was Eleanor Webb, Marcus's wife, who had arrived in Deadwood only 2 weeks earlier after completing her nursing duties at a military hospital in Colorado Territory. She approached him with the concerned expression of a woman who had learned to read the signs of her husband's encounters with the darker aspects of frontier justice. "Marcus, what happened?" Mrs. Chen from the general store said there were gunshots and someone screaming about seeing ghosts. Marcus looked at his wife, a strong woman with intelligent eyes and hands that had saved more lives than his gun had taken, and struggled to find words that would convey the impossibility of what he had just experienced without causing her unnecessary alarm. "There's something strange happening in this town, Eleanor," he said finally. "Something connected to Sheriff Callahan's disappearance. I need to do some research, talk to some of the old-timers who were here when the mining operations first started." Eleanor studied her husband's face with the practiced eye of someone who had seen men return from encounters that changed them. "This isn't just about a missing sheriff anymore, is it?" Marcus shook his head, glancing back at the mining office where he could swear he saw a massive shadow moving past one of the upper windows. "No, I don't think it is. I think we're dealing with something that goes back much further than Tobias Callahan. Something that might explain why this town has always felt like it's sitting on top of a powder keg ready to explode." As they walked back toward their temporary lodgings, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not just by the usual collection of early risers and curious townspeople, but by something else entirely. Something that cast no shadow despite the growing daylight, something that moved with the weight and presence of a man twice the size of any normal human being. The message carved into the wall of the mining office echoed in his mind like a warning bell. "The truth lies beneath the mountain. Find the Apache bones." Marcus realized that his investigation into Sheriff Callahan's disappearance was about to become something much larger and more dangerous than a simple missing person case. He was about to uncover secrets that someone, or something, had been willing to kill to protect. And as the sun rose fully over Deadwood, casting long shadows across the muddy streets and wooden sidewalks, Marcus Webb had no idea that he was about to come face to face with a force that existed somewhere between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, driven by a hunger for justice that death itself could not satisfy. The morning sun had barely crested the hills surrounding Deadwood when Marcus Webb found himself standing outside the weathered cabin of Joseph Crow Feather, the last surviving member of the Lakota band that had once claimed these mountains as sacred hunting grounds. The old man's dwelling sat on a small rise overlooking the town, close enough to observe the daily activities of the white settlers but far enough removed to maintain the solitude that seemed to define his existence since the mining boom had transformed the landscape of his ancestors. Marcus had spent the better part of 3 hours tracking down information about Crow Feather, learning from various townspeople that the elderly Lakota had worked sporadically as a guide for mining expeditions in the early days of Deadwood's founding. More importantly, several sources had mentioned that Sheriff Callahan had been seen visiting the old man's cabin on multiple occasions in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, conversations that had apparently grown increasingly heated as time progressed. The cabin itself was a modest structure built from local timber and chinked with a mixture of mud and grass that had weathered to a gray-brown color that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the stone chimney, and Marcus could see movement through the single window that faced the town below. As he approached the front door, he became aware of being watched, though he couldn't pinpoint the source of the sensation. "Joseph Crow Feather," Marcus called out, stopping several yards from the door in a gesture of respect he had learned during his years working in territories with significant Native American populations. "I'm Deputy Marshal Webb. I'd like to speak with you about Sheriff Callahan." The door opened slowly, revealing a man whose age was difficult to determine but whose bearing suggested both great wisdom and profound weariness. Crow Feather stood nearly as tall as Marcus, with silver-gray hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated knowledge of decades spent watching the transformation of his homeland. His clothing was a practical mixture of traditional buckskin and modern wool, adapted to the realities of living between two worlds. "I wondered when someone would come asking the right questions," Crow Feather said, his English heavily accented but precise. "Most white men in this town prefer comfortable lies to dangerous truths. Come inside, Marshal. What I have to tell you is not meant for the open air." The interior of the cabin was sparse but comfortable, furnished with a mixture of handcrafted wooden furniture and items that spoke to Crow Feather's complex relationship with both his traditional heritage and the changing world around him. A rifle hung above the fireplace, and Marcus noticed several books on a small shelf, their titles suggesting an educated man who had made considerable effort to understand the culture that had displaced his own. Crow Feather gestured for Marcus to sit at a rough-hewn table while he prepared coffee in a battered metal pot. "Sheriff Callahan came to me because he had begun to understand that Deadwood was built on a foundation of desecrated bones," the old man said without preamble. "The miners who first worked these mountains showed no respect for the burial grounds of my people. They blasted through sacred sites, scattered the remains of our ancestors, and built their fortunes on ground that should have been left undisturbed." Marcus accepted a cup of the strong, bitter coffee and waited for Crow Feather to continue. The old man's manner suggested that this conversation had been building for months, perhaps years, and that he was finally ready to share knowledge that he had kept largely to himself. 3 years ago, when the main veins began to play out, the mining company started exploring deeper into the mountain, Crow Feather continued, settling into a chair across from Marcus. "They found chambers that had been sealed for generations, burial caves where my people laid their dead to rest according to traditions that go back beyond memory. Instead of respecting what they had found, they destroyed everything in their search for more gold." The old man paused, staring out the window toward the mountains that loomed over Deadwood like sleeping giants. "That's when the accident started. Cave-ins that killed experienced miners who had worked underground for decades. Equipment failures that had no logical explanation. Men who went into the mines healthy and came out speaking of shadows that moved independently of any light source." Marcus set down his coffee cup, beginning to understand the connection between Crow Feather's story and the mysterious circumstances surrounding Sheriff Callahan's disappearance. "What did Sheriff Callahan want from you?" "He wanted to know about the burial rituals of my people, specifically about what happens when the dead are not properly honored," Crow Feather replied. Big Tom was not a superstitious man, but he had seen things in those mines that challenged his understanding of the world. He told me about finding chambers filled with bones that had been scattered and broken, mixed with mining equipment and blasting powder as if the dead were nothing more than obstacles to be cleared away. The old man rose from his chair and walked to a wooden chest that sat against the far wall of the cabin. From it, he withdrew a leather-bound journal that he placed carefully on the table between them. Sheriff Callahan kept detailed records of his investigations into the mining accidents. What he discovered in those tunnels convinced him that the disturbance of our burial grounds had awakened something that should have remained at rest. Marcus opened the journal, immediately recognizing Callahan's distinctive handwriting in the precisely recorded entries that filled page after page. The sheriff's notes began nearly 2 years earlier, initially focusing on routine investigations into mining accidents and equipment thefts. But as Marcus read further, the entries began to document increasingly strange occurrences that defied rational explanation. One entry, dated just 3 months before Callahan's disappearance, described the discovery of a mining tunnel that had been sealed from the inside by what appeared to be massive blocks of stone, moved into place with a precision and strength that would have required heavy machinery that had never been brought into that section of the mine. Another entry documented the testimony of miners who claimed to have seen a figure of enormous size moving through the tunnels, always just beyond the reach of their lantern light. According to my people's traditions, Crowfeather explained as Marcus continued reading, when the dead are not properly honored, when their bones are scattered and their burial sites destroyed, they may return as angry spirits seeking justice for the wrongs committed against them. But in cases where great violence has been done, where sacred places have been deliberately desecrated, the spirits may grow stronger rather than weaker with time. Marcus looked up from the journal, remembering the carved message he had discovered in the mining office and the impossibly large footprints that had glowed with their own inner light. "Are you saying that Sheriff Callahan became one of these angry spirits?" The old man shook his head slowly. "Not exactly. I believe that Big Tom was chosen by the ancestral spirits to serve as their instrument of justice. The sheriff was a man who understood the importance of maintaining balance, of ensuring that wrongs were made right. When he discovered the extent of the desecration that had occurred in the burial caves, he began working to find a way to appease the angry dead." Crowfeather returned to the wooden chest and withdrew a second object, this one wrapped in soft buckskin and clearly of great personal significance. As he unwrapped it, Marcus saw that it was a ceremonial pipe, its bowl carved from red stone and decorated with intricate symbols that spoke to generations of spiritual tradition. 2 weeks before his disappearance, Sheriff Callahan asked me to perform a cleansing ritual in the deepest section of the mine, where the worst desecration had occurred, Crowfeather said, cradling the pipe in his weathered hands. He believed that if we could properly honor the disturbed spirits, we might be able to restore the balance that had been destroyed by the mining operations. Marcus felt a chill as he began to understand the implications of what Crowfeather was telling him. What happened during this ritual? The spirits accepted Sheriff Callahan's offer to serve as their champion, the old man replied simply. But the price of that acceptance was his transformation from a living man into something that exists between the world of the flesh and the realm of the dead. He became what my people call a bridge walker, a being capable of moving between both worlds to carry out the will of the ancestors. The journal entries in Marcus's hands suddenly took on a new and terrifying significance. Callahan's final recorded notes described his growing sense of connection to the disturbed spirits, his increasing ability to sense their presence and understand their demands for justice. The last entry, dated just 3 days before his disappearance, contained a single line that made Marcus's blood run cold: "They have shown me what must be done. The guilty will be held accountable." "Who are the guilty?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Crowfeather's expression darkened as he looked toward the town spread out below his cabin. The men who ordered the destruction of the burial sites. The mine supervisors who knew they were desecrating sacred ground and continued their operations anyway. The investors who profited from the sacrilege without caring about the consequences. Marcus closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, trying to process the magnitude of what he was learning. If Crowfeather's account was accurate, Sheriff Callahan had not simply disappeared but had been transformed into some kind of supernatural avenger, empowered by the spirits of the dead to exact justice against those responsible for the desecration of Native American burial grounds. "How many men are we talking about?" Marcus asked. 7, Crowfeather replied without hesitation. 7 men who knew exactly what they were destroying and chose profit over respect for the dead. Sheriff Callahan had identified all of them before his transformation, and he was methodically gathering evidence of their crimes. The old man rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the mountains with an expression that mixed sadness with grim satisfaction. 3 of them have already disappeared over the past 6 months. Harrison Blake, the mining engineer who designed the blasting patterns that destroyed the burial chambers. Samuel Morrison, the foreman who supervised the removal of bones and artifacts that should have been left undisturbed. And Thomas Whitman, the assayer who falsified reports to hide evidence of the desecration from territorial authorities. Marcus felt his heart skip as he realized that he had investigated all 3 of these disappearances during his time in Deadwood, treating them as separate incidents rather than part of a larger pattern. In each case, the missing men had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and grieving families who had no explanation for their loved one's fate. What about the other 4? Marcus asked, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. 2 of them have already fled Deadwood, Crow Feather replied. Jonathan Pierce and Michael Kellerman left town 3 weeks ago, supposedly to pursue mining opportunities in Colorado Territory. The remaining 2 are still here, still living in houses built with money earned from the desecration of my people's sacred places. Marcus stood up from the table, understanding that his investigation had taken a turn that would require him to confront forces beyond the scope of normal law enforcement. I need to know who these last 2 men are, and I need to understand what Sheriff Callahan intends to do about them. Crow Feather turned from the window, his ancient eyes meeting Marcus's with an intensity that spoke to the gravity of the situation. One is Mayor Davidson, who provided the legal authorization for the mining companies to expand their operations into areas that should have been protected. The other is Doc Williams, who examined the human remains found in the burial chambers and deliberately misidentified them as animal bones to avoid complications with territorial authorities. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Mayor Davidson was one of the most prominent citizens in Deadwood, a man whose political connections extended throughout the Dakota Territory. Doc Williams was the town's only physician, a man whose services were essential to the health and welfare of every resident. If Sheriff Callahan's supernatural justice was indeed targeting these men, the entire social structure of the community could collapse. When will it happen? Marcus asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. Soon, Crow Feather replied. The spirits grow stronger as the anniversary of the worst desecration approaches. In 2 nights, it will be exactly 3 years since the mining companies blasted through the central burial chamber, scattering the bones of 47 of my ancestors like worthless debris. That is when Big Tom will complete his mission. Marcus paced to the window, looking down at Deadwood with new eyes as he tried to formulate a plan that could address the supernatural threat without dismissing the legitimate grievances that had created it. The town below looked deceptively peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, its residents going about their daily business unaware that they were living on the edge of a reckoning that had been building for 3 years. Is there any way to stop him? Marcus asked, turning back to face Crow Feather. The old man considered the question carefully before responding. Sheriff Callahan is not evil, Marshal Webb. He is serving as an instrument of justice for wrongs that were never addressed through your legal system. If you want to stop him, you must first acknowledge the crimes that were committed and take meaningful action to make amends. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. As the senior law enforcement officer in Deadwood, he was being asked to navigate between the demands of supernatural justice and the practical realities of maintaining order in a community that depended on the very men who had apparently committed crimes against the dead. What kind of amends? Marcus asked. The scattered bones must be properly gathered and reburied according to our traditions, Crow Feather explained. The burial sites must be sealed and protected from further disturbance. And those responsible must acknowledge their crimes and make restitution to the families of the dead. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation, and Marcus looked out the window to see his wife Eleanor riding up the path toward the cabin on her small brown mare. Her medical training had apparently led her to seek out the same sources of information that had brought Marcus to Crow Feather's door, and her arrival suggested that the situation in town was becoming more urgent. Eleanor dismounted and hurried toward the cabin, her face flushed with exertion and concern. Marcus, you need to come back to town immediately. Doc Williams is missing, and Mayor Davidson is barricaded in his house claiming that something impossible is trying to kill him. Marcus exchanged glances with Crow Feather, understanding that the supernatural reckoning they had been discussing was no longer a future possibility but a present reality. The transformation of Sheriff Tobias Callahan from missing person to otherworldly Avenger was about to reach its climax, and Marcus realized that he had very little time to prevent Deadwood from descending into chaos. "What exactly did Mayor Davidson tell you?" Marcus asked as the three of them prepared to ride back to town. "He claims that something the size of a grizzly bear but walking upright broke down his front door last night," Eleanor replied, her voice reflecting both skepticism and genuine concern. "He says it spoke to him in Sheriff Callahan's voice, listing crimes he committed 3 years ago and promising that justice would be served. The mayor has been drinking heavily, and half the town thinks he's lost his mind." As they mounted their horses and began the ride back to Deadwood, Marcus found himself caught between his duty to maintain law and order and his growing understanding that the forces at work in the town transcended the normal boundaries of legal authority. The ghost of Sheriff Tobias Callahan had returned not as a mindless spirit seeking random vengeance, but as an agent of justice carrying out a mission that the living world had failed to address. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains as they approached the outskirts of town, and Marcus could see crowds gathering in the streets as word of the mayor's claim spread throughout the community. The rational part of his mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation for the events that were unfolding, but the evidence he had gathered over the past 24 hours suggested that he was dealing with forces that existed beyond the realm of normal human experience. As they rode down Main Street toward the mayor's house, Marcus caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Standing in the shadows between two buildings, barely visible in the gathering dusk, was a figure of impossible size and stature. Even at a distance, Marcus could see that it stood well over 8 feet tall, with proportions that suggested immense physical power and a presence that seemed to bend the very air around it. The figure turned toward them as they passed, and Marcus found himself looking into eyes that glowed with the same phosphorescent light he had seen in the footprints at the mining office. For a brief moment that felt like an eternity, those eyes held his own, and Marcus felt the full weight of supernatural judgment being brought to bear on his own role in the events that were unfolding. Then the figure stepped back into the shadows and vanished, leaving Marcus to wonder whether he had actually seen the ghost of Tobias Callahan or simply experienced a hallucination brought on by the stress and impossibility of his current situation. But as they continued toward Mayor Davidson's house, Marcus realized that the distinction no longer mattered. Whether real or imagined, the presence he had encountered represented a force of justice that would not be denied, and his only choice was to find a way to work with that force rather than against it. The crowd gathered around the mayor's house parted as Marcus approached, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, fear, and the kind of morbid fascination that drew people to witness events that challenged their understanding of the world. Mayor Davidson's house was a substantial 2-story structure that reflected his status as one of Deadwood's most successful citizens, but now its broken front door and shattered windows suggested that wealth and political influence offered no protection against the justice of the dead. As Marcus dismounted and approached the house, he realized that his investigation into Sheriff Callahan's disappearance was about to become something much more significant. He was about to confront the physical manifestation of wrongs that had never been acknowledged, crimes that had never been punished, and a form of justice that existed outside the boundaries of human law but demanded recognition nonetheless. The ghost of the elder sheriff was real, and it was indeed much bigger than anyone could dream.